or you walked outside and there's a flat tire. But he can take the events that are in your life and try to turn them in a way to make you feel as if your life is going the wrong direction. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Genesis chapter 50 and verse number 19. Genesis chapter 50, verse number 19, the scripture says this, as they throw it up there. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God. Fear not, for am I in the place of God. Okay? So here we have something that Joseph says specifically to his brothers. And he's saying, listen, God's already got this all under control. All right? Go to verse 20. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. So I want to talk to you this morning on this subject. How can this happen to me, or how could this happen to me? And tie it into what we've already been talking about. So in the first lesson, we grounded all offended people into two categories. The first one was those that were genuinely mistreated. Somebody actually meant to mistreat them. And then the second one is those who thought that they were mistreated, not because they didn't necessarily have a right to be offended by what happened, but just the fact that the person that did the offense didn't necessarily mean to offend them. I've made offenses before by accident, by, saying something that wasn't politically correct, or not mentioning something specific, or forgetting someone's birthday, or so on and so forth. So, those things tend to happen in a genuine basis, but that they're not meant to make an offense. They didn't mean to offend you. So in the lesson today, we're going to address the first category. We're going to deal with it specifically. Those that have been genuinely mistreated, okay? Those that were meant to be offended. So in this particular lesson, let me ask you a question to start it. If you have been genuinely mistreated, do you have the right to be offended? That's the question that you have to ask yourself. If someone meant to mistreat you or offend you, do you still have the right to carry that offense? For the answer, we're going to look into the study of Jacob's life here, of his favorite son, and that's Joseph. And if we take it for a moment and look at it, we will see that in the next few days, I want you to take some time, and I want you to read Genesis chapters 37 through 48. We're not going to delve into it today and start reading these. I want you to read these for yourself so that you can see the whole story. But understand this, that Joseph was meant to be offended. His brothers wanted to offend him, okay? And it started with a dream that becomes a nightmare. You see, Joseph was Jacob's 11th son, and the reason why he was the favorite is because Jacob had worked so many years for his wife, Rachel, right? Leah was the first one to give him sons, but Rachel was the one that he actually loved. And so then Joseph is born, and he's the first one that's born of her. She had given her handmaid to him, and he'd had a son or two by her handmaid, which would have been considered her son, but this was technically the first child of their relationship. And so he becomes a favorite son, one that he gives the coat of many colors to, doesn't send him to the field like the other brothers are sent to the field, and so on and so forth. So he is set apart from the rest. Now, you can look at this in two areas. You can use this same description saying that Dad didn't mean to offend the others, but they became offended by the actions. Or you can look at the specific action here and see that, God is showing Joseph that not only is he favored by his father, but that God has a very special plan for him. Does that make the plan for the others any less important? No. But in this specific instance, it seems that the plan that Joseph is being given is being exalted above the plans that the others have. So when we see this, God gave Joseph 2 dreams, right? In the first dream, he saw a band of sheaves in the field, and his sheaf that he made arose above and upright were the sheaves that his brothers had made, and those sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. So in that specific instance, of course, he begins to tell his brothers about his dream. Hey, we were in the field, and we all do this. We all have dreams, and we end up sharing our dreams with somebody. And, if you dream that you get $1 million and somebody else dreams that they've been, in debt $1 million, they're going to be a little bit jealous of your dream. It's just normal nature for humanity to do such. But when we see this specific dream, they took it as a little bit more than that. They were already jealous at the fact that he was being put above them or being set aside from them. So we already see that the enemy is already working on their heart. You understand what I'm saying here? There's already this assignment that's being set. So the enemy's already speaking in the brain. Okay? And then we see, as we go forward and look at it, that then there comes a second dream. And in the second dream, you have the sun, the moon, and 11 stars. Okay? Representing his father, his mother, and his brothers. And those bow down to him, right? And so not only does this time does he tell his brothers, but he tells his father also. And of course, the law that it was, the dad doesn't bow down to the sons bow down to the dad. And, he says, you need to hush with this nonsense stuff. There's no way that your mother and I are going to bow down to you. That's not going to happen. You're the 11th son. I'm going to put this back into perspective here. Reuben is the one that's going to get everything, not you, or Simeon, or one of the upper ups. You're the 11th on the totem pole, as my mother-in-law tells me. You're at the bottom of the totem pole. You're on the pole, but you're the furthest down the list, is what she said. And of course, she didn't mean anything by it. She was trying to say that I was, her favorite, her second favorite son-in-law, right? She has 2. We're both equal, but he was in the family before I was what she was trying to say, but she didn't get there. So my father-in-law still have a joke about that every once in a while because, he passed on, and now there's a new brother-in-law, and I said, well, at least I moved up the totem pole, But he makes better deer meat than I do, so I don't know. They might have bumped me back down the totem pole for all I know. But anyways, so you have this jealousy that's moving within the family. And this jealousy is becoming such a huge thing that, the sheaves and the stars and all this stuff is taking place. So shortly after that, his 10 older brothers devise a plan. They went to feed their father's flock in the field, and Jacob sent Joseph to see how they were doing. Parents, that's a bad thing to do sometimes, to send the younger one to check on the older one. You tell them not to tell, no, don't tattle, but I still want to know what they're doing. And so Joseph's going to come back and tell them, Dad, look, they're not where they're supposed to be. They're over in that city. Your flock's out in the field. And Joseph didn't want to do that. So he begins to follow them and trying to find them, so on and so forth. And they see him in a distance, and they come up with this plan. Here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him. And then we shall see what will become of his dreams. He says he's going to be a leader over us. Let him try to lead us when he is dead. You see how the offense is becoming to fruition into an actual resentment that's becoming there. And when they actually are going to kill him, but Joseph's brother Reuben intervened and said, no, let's just throw him in a pit. Let's just teach him a lesson. Let's teach him that we're older than he is, that he's still going to have to bow to us. And so they throw him in a pit for him to die, and they took his coat away, and they rip it up, and they stain it with animal's blood to convince their fathers that he was destroyed of a wild beast. And after they threw him in the pit, they saw a company of Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. And then Judah comes up with a bright plan. Hey, wait a minute, guys. Instead of just letting him die in a pit and letting his murder be on our hands, let's just sell him into slavery. It'd be as if he's dead. He'll never come back to bother us no more, but we didn't kill him. You know? So if we let him rot in the pit, what's it going to profit us? But if we sell him, we both accomplish the fact that he's never coming back, and we're going to get the fact that we're going to get a little money off this deal too. You know? So their offense becomes into something that changes from what would be a normal behavior. Joseph had offended them, so they did what? They betrayed him. When an offense is so integrated into our heart that it becomes bitter, most people turn to betrayal. That's what happens. They betray the person that originally they probably would have loved, but they end up betraying them. So these brothers who did this with the same father, the same flesh, the same blood, had a little bit of different mothers, but they were in the same family. They were considered brothers. Think about this for a second. Our American culture is very different, so it's hard for us to understand the severity of what the brothers did. What they did was worse than killing him. You see, they kept him from receiving his father's name, which was very, very, very important. The father's name is how they were recognized. The name was very important. So by selling him into slavery, they were getting rid of his whole identity. He was no longer Jacob's son. He was a slave. And the woman he would marry would be a slave. His kids would be slaves. He would never be able to get out of slavery. It's never going to happen. It would have been better for Joseph under those circumstances just to cut his throat and get rid of him. By selling him into slavery, they weren't doing him any favors. They were actually making it worse. So we have to put that in our understanding that his very own flesh and blood thought of the worst thing that they could do. I put y'all back there to help me, not be back there and play. So we have to understand, when we see this, when he would have been born a slave, it would have been a hard thing, but he wasn't. People that were born into slavery, they didn't know the much difference. I mean, they dreamed of having something different, but they didn't know much different. But you take a free person who is not only free, but was pretty wealthy, and you take them and put them into slavery, that's going to be a harder pill to swallow, okay? So being born an heir with wealth and great future and only have it stripped away, it would have been much easier for Joseph to never knew what would have been or what could have been. It was as if he was a living dead man. Imagine you know your dreams are from God. You know your dream is from God. He gave you a dream. And in the moment you're thrown into a pit and the Ishmaelites tie you up and put you with a horse, not on a horse, with a horse, and you have to walk all the way to Egypt in the smell of what comes out of that horse, because they don't put you on the north side, they put you on the south side of the northbound, or maybe they were heading south. I don't know which direction they were headed, but he was behind the horse or the donkey or whatever. You got to walk in that stuff. You went from a coat of many colors, probably taking baths in nice, smelling stuff, to now you stink and you're being sold. That's a difficult thing for him or for me to understand, because it's not something that's ever happened to me. I'm sure he was tempted to wish that his brothers had just killed him. The point is this: what Joseph's brothers did was very evil and cruel. They meant to offend him. They meant to mistreat him. The question is, does he have a right to be offended? Now I want you to think about that for a second. When we say, that person offended me, that person did such and such, that person did this, or I was betrayed by so-and-so, do we have the right to keep that offense locked away in a box somewhere for us to remember? See, Jesus was also betrayed. He was sold by a friend. This person, and get this and understand this. What happened previous to Jesus being sold, right? They're in the Last Supper, right? What did Jesus do? What was one of the acts that Jesus did in the Last Supper? We're going to teach on this in a couple of weeks on a Wednesday night, but just to kind of bring it to your understanding, what did Jesus do as one of the last acts? He went around and washed their feet. Remember? Do you think he just washed Peter's feet? Huh? Did Jesus know who was going to betray him? And he still washed his feet. Imagine you knowing that that person's going to betray you. It hasn't been made public knowledge yet. So you're not doing this out of hypocritical act. You understand what I'm saying? This isn't a hypocritical thing that you're doing. This is a statement of true love. He doesn't know that you know. So imagine how Judas felt as Jesus is washing his feet, knowing that he just made a deal for this man's life. And when Jesus gets up, he whispers in your ear, "Now, brother, friend, do it quickly." What? You just washed my feet. So he was betrayed by a friend that woke up every morning with him. But you see, and we're going to touch this in the next sermon, and just in the sermon here in a little bit, but I want to bring this to notice here, that the Jews had a different idea of what the Messiah was supposed to be. And Judas was falling in line with those thoughts. He's throwing money away, and he's not taking power. It's just, this isn't what I thought I signed up for. I thought I was signing up to be one of his princes. And yet we just go around breaking alabaster boxes. We could have sold that. And now they want to get rid of him, and I just don't believe this guy's the Messiah. I just don't believe it. So I'll help them. And then to be sitting in a room with a man that looks at you with dear love in his eyes, washes your feet, feeds you, tells everybody that he's going to be betrayed. You walk up to him and say, "Is it me?" And he looks at you and says, "Yeah, it's you. Go ahead and do it. Get it over with, quickly. I'm not going to stop you." What? He was killed by his brothers? The very people that he healed? That he came to save? He's being hanged on a tree? Didn't he have the right to be offended? But we hear him say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now, understand something here. They knew full well what they were doing within their own heart. In their heart, they were getting rid of somebody who was innocent but had claimed to be God, and he didn't fit their God. You understand what I'm saying? They had a different concept of what God was. You cannot have a preconceived idea of what God is, because you will fail every time when it comes to that matter. So because of their preconceived idea of who God was, they end up killing him, and that's why Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They don't understand that I'm God manifest in the flesh. That's what the forgiveness was. People who tend to offend you don't understand that they're not fighting against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. So if we look at this with perfect hindsight, you probably already know the outcome of Joseph's story. It's not how Joseph experienced it, but why, when we are going through major trials and temptations we can go through, to back and understand in the back of the book that we win. But Joseph couldn't see the ending. See, we have the back of the book, but he didn't. He didn't know what was going to take place. He's just living day by day as it is. It looked as if he would never see his father or his God-given dream being fulfilled. He was now a slave in a foreign nation. He couldn't leave Egypt. He was the property of another man for his life. And it wasn't even his fault. He didn't do anything wrong. His brothers had put him there, and he had been genuinely mistreated. Didn't he have a right to be offended? I mean, by our own justifications, we would think he would have a right to be offended. I mean, think about it. Joseph was sold to a man named Potiphar, an officer in Pharaoh's, a captain of the guard. He served there for about 10 years. 10 years. He served this man. He never had a word from his family. He didn't know if his father was alive or dead. Their lives had gone on without him, and Joseph had no hope of his father's rescue. As time went on, Joseph found favor in his master's eyes and was treated well. And Potiphar set him up over the whole household, but he was still a slave. It wasn't like he could just go to town when he wanted to go to town. He was still a slave. But as things began to look better for Joseph, something else went wrong. Think about it for a second. You finally, he accepts the slave lifestyle, right? He's, okay, I'm a slave. I'm going to serve this man as if he were God. I'm not going to worship him as God, but I'm going to do this as if it's under the Lord. And he gains favor in the man's eyes, and he's second in all of the house. Anything that Joseph wanted was his, except one thing. And he knew what that one thing was. And she casts her long eyes, eyelashes. She probably put on some extra perfume. She curled them babies. You know, put on the Joker lipstick, you know, it comes way up the mouth, you know, just, she's looking like a doll. Joseph, I need some wine. He comes around the corner with his wine, whatever it was that she tried to get him in, and she begins to seduce him. No doubt it was a temptation. I have no doubt in my mind the man was tempted. Understand the thought here pattern for a moment. Put yourself in his shoes. You've been sold by your brothers. You've been serving this man for 10 years. Why should I continue to live for God? Why? I've done nothing but good. And now I have an opportunity to just have a few minutes of enjoyment. But Joseph still chose not to be offended. He said, no. She gets mad, rips her clothes, He leaves his jacket because she's got a hold of it. And she screams. He did right. And still gets thrown in prison. You talking about a man that is down on his luck. You talk about a man that, and understand this. Their prisons weren't nothing like American prisons. They didn't have TV time. They didn't have a weight yard where the prisoners could become more bulked than the guys that are keeping them. They didn't have daylight time, food time, bingo time, library time. They didn't have a college inside there where your tax dollars pay for them to get their degree inside prison. No. There was no sunlight, no workout areas, just a sunken room or a pit void of sunlight and warmth. The conditions were crude and inhumane. Prisoners were put there to rot as they survived on just bread and water. The scripture says in 1 Kings 22 and 27, it says this: put this fellow in the prison and feed him with bread of affliction and with water of affliction until I come in peace. This wasn't a, hey, we're going to feed you Salisbury steak tonight. It's made out of soybeans, but we're going to feed it to you. That's not what it was. This was a very little small, and the bread probably had mold on it that you had to pick off of it, and the water was not clear. You couldn't say, hey, can I have some ice water, please? There's no telling where they got this water. They were given just enough food to survive so they could suffer. Look at Psalms 105 and 18. In the second part of it says, Joseph, who was sold for a servant, whose feet they hurt with fetters, and he was laid in iron. He was put in a dungeon to die. He was a foreign slave who was accused of rape. Egyptians had a chance to get out. This guy was going nowhere. You understand what I'm saying here, right? He was not an Egyptian citizen. He was a slave from a foreign country who was accused of raping the captain's wife. He's lucky they didn't kill him. Or maybe he probably wishes they would have killed him. So again, he's genuinely mistreated. Not once, but now twice. So surely now he has a right to be mad, right? Woo! I can see the steam in the room. It's like coming out the ears. He's hot. No, he wasn't. You'd think things couldn't have gotten any worse. Joseph had gone as low as a person can go without being dead. Just think about what the thoughts that could be coming out of his mind in the damp darkness of that dungeon. I served my master with honesty and integrity for over 10 years. I'm even more faithful than his wife is. I stayed loyal to God and my master, daily fleeing sexual immorality. What is my reward? A dungeon. It seems the more I tried to do what is right, the worse it gets. How could God allow this? Could my brothers steal my promise from God too? Why hasn't this mighty covenant that God intervened on my behalf? Is this how a loving, faithful God cares for his servants? Why me? What have I done to deserve this? I only believed I heard from God. You ever felt like you've wrestled with some of the same thoughts? Yes. You know, today's going to be a theme, just like last Sunday was, in a way, but in a different, more, not in a warning setting. So we're getting there. Wait to the third lesson today. So it's funny how God has put all this together. I'll be honest with you. This series of stuff I started working on last August, and God has put it together for a timely manner to get us ready for something. So you're on to something, Sister Maria. Just hang on there for a second, okay? So I know I would have had some of the same thoughts, right? Some of the same mentalities, the same challenges. I do every day. I get up every morning. I pray, I thank the Lord, I do something, I try to do right by people, and then all of a sudden something goes wrong, you know, your car's messed up, something doesn't happen right, you know, and you think to yourself in your mind, you know, what have you done wrong, you know? People think that God's just dangling them over a fire of hell, ready just to cut the string at any moment, and that's not at all what God is trying to do, but that's what goes on in our mind. How many of us of those same thoughts have run through our minds in times of our tribulation? He had a very limited freedom in his life, but he still had the right to choose his response. See, they can take everything away from you that you have, but your choice. Nobody can take your choice away from you. How you choose to respond is your choice. Would he become offended and bitter toward his brothers and eventually towards God? Would he give up all hope of the promise and fulfillment, robbing himself of his last incentive to live? The question you have to ask yourself is God in control? Do you believe God is in control? Because if you believe God is in control, where you are is where God has placed you. Hello? God has put you there for a purpose and a reason. He already knew what was going to take place before it ever happened. It's still your responsibility to choose what is right and what is wrong. Imagine it never crossed Joseph's mind until it was all over with that this was God's process to prepare him for a rule. How would his future authority over these brothers who betrayed him? How would he use it? Joseph was learning obedience by what he suffered. His brothers were skillfully wielding instruments in the hand of God. Would Joseph hold fast to the promise, seeking for his purpose in his life for God? It has been said that God places some people in your life for sandpaper. It hurts when they rub up against you. But in the end, you're smooth, and they will be old and worn out, and you'll shine. I'm convinced that the reason why people are placed in our lives is to keep us on our knees. Because if everybody was perfect, then we wouldn't trust God. Your neighbors, your coworkers, bosses, your friends, pastors, Sunday school teachers, they're all placed in your life for a purpose. God has allowed you to be in those positions for a purpose so that God can use you when the time comes and you learn something from him and the circumstances that you have. Perhaps when Joseph had his dream, he saw them as a confirmation of favor in God on his life. And yet, he did not understand what that favor meant. Guys, the reason why you go through certain trials is because God trusts you. to make the right choice. And when we don't make the right choice, guess what God's going to do the next time? He's going to send us back through the same trial till we learn to make the right choice. Often in these training periods, we focus on the impossibility of our circumstances instead of the greatness of God. Authority is given to serve, not to set you apart. See, there's a difference in serving and leading and trusting than it is just to have favor. As a result, we're discouraged and need to blame someone. So we look for the one we feel is responsible for our despair. And when we face the fact that God could have prevented our whole mess and didn't, we blame God. Folks, I could sit back and tell you all the things of the reason why I can blame God. How many nights a strange guy climbed into my bed when I was 3 and 4 years old and did ungodly things to me that was supposed to be my older step-siblings? A grandfather that did some stuff? A mother that gave me away so many times, and I was just a baby, a kid. I hadn't done nothing wrong. Do you choose to blame God, or do you choose to love God? See, those are the things that you have to choose, because offenses, people who use their environment as a crutch to send them down the wrong path is not the answer. You have to choose the other side of things and realize that God is preparing you for something different. We need to realize that in order to get to the top of many times, we have to go to the bottom, as Sister Maria said. In order to get to the top, we first must go to the bottom. An example, when Nehemiah felt the urgency to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem before God allowed him to rebuild the walls, he sent him to where? Look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verse number 13. We look at the scripture and he says, "And I went out by night. Nobody else could see. By the gate of the valley, the lowest place, even before the dragon well, the place where the wild animals drank water, and to the dung port," which is where all the human waste was put. So before he was able to go rebuild the wall, God sent him through the dunghill. Again, we have to understand some things. That God is not always going to make your favor look like favor to you. It's there to teach you some things and to build your character. Example, Al Schneider, the owner of the Executive Inn and the Galt House Hotels, as well as a lumber yard and a bowling alley, made every employee start at the bottom. Even his own family members, who eventually were going to run the business. They had to start out waiting tables and cleaning hotel rooms. Every employee loved working for Mr. Schneider because he was a fair man. And when they were sick, he paid their hospital bills. When they needed help, he was there for them. The person that wrote this says, "I remember one lady in particular, Candy, had very bad crooked teeth, and Mr. Schneider even paid for her teeth repaired. And because of it, she developed so much more confidence about herself, and they respected him because they knew when they were doing the dirty work, it was preparing them for advancement." Many times God puts us through things because he wants us to do great things. How can greater things than these shall you do unless you first understand how to suffer for Christ's sake? Joseph's mind had to be going crazy. I'm sure he was thinking, I've lived according to what I know of God. I've not transgressed his statutes or his nature. I was only repeating a dream that I felt God gave me. And what's the result? My brother betrays me, and I'm sold as a slave. My dad thinks I'm dead and is never going to come to Egypt to find me. To him, the bottom line was his brothers. They were the force that had thrown him into the dungeon and the downward spiral of the life of his events. Maybe he entertained the thought that if that chance ever comes where they do bow before me, I'm going to take their head off. He probably thought, when God puts me in that position of authority, I'll make them suffer like they've made me suffer. How often do we hear our brothers and sisters fall into the same trap of assigning blame? For example, if it weren't for my wife, I'd be in the ministry. She has hindered me and ruined so much of what I have dreamed of. If it weren't for my husband demanding my time, I would have more time to sell out for God. If it weren't for my parents, I would have had a normal life. They are to blame for where I am today. How come others have normal parents and I don't? If my mom and dad didn't get divorced, I would have been much better off in my own marriage. If it weren't for my pastor repressing my gift that's in me, I would be free and unhindered. He kept me from fulfilling my ministry and my destiny. He has turned the people of the church against me. If it weren't for my former wife, I wouldn't have had all these financial troubles. If it weren't for the woman in the church, I'd still be in favor with the leaders. Her gossip, she's destroyed me and any hope of me ever being respected. And the list goes on and on and on and on. I mean, these statements were pulled right out of the Sunday school lesson. I didn't write those. Those are responses that people have heard other people say and have put them down. It's easy to blame someone else for the problems that we have. So imagine how much better off it would be if we'd never been around those people. You know, that your disappointment and your hurt because of their fault. Absolutely, and let me say this, and I want you to hear what I say. Absolutely no man, no woman, no child, or even the devil can get you out of the will of God. Write it down. Nobody can. No one but God holds your destiny. No one. So everything that has happened in your life, God has already set in place. He already knew it was going to take place. Joseph's brothers tried hard to destroy the vision that God gave him. They thought they had ended it for Joseph. They said it out of their mouths. You know, in Genesis 37 and 20, they said, "Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit, and we shall see what comes of his dreams." They were out to destroy him. It was no accident. It was deliberate. They wanted no chance of ever seeing him succeed. How would Joseph fare in the church today if he was like most of us? Think about it. Would he be going to other people talking about how his brothers had offended him? Would he be plotting for revenge? Would he comfort himself with thoughts like, when I get my hands on them, or if I could tell them what was on my mind, or if I could just give them just a little piece of what I'm going through? If Joseph had actually had that attitude, God would have left him in the dungeon to rot. Think about it. It wasn't the fact that he had favor with God. The favor with God is what put him in the dungeon. When you get your head wrapped around that, that's going to really blow your mind. His favor with God is what put him in the dungeon. Because if he had not been in the dungeon, he would have never heard the other dreams. You see what I'm saying? His whole spiral out of control had nothing to do with his brothers. It had everything to do with God. To place him in a place where he could be non-offended. The one who treated Joseph so wickedly were the patriarchs of Israel. The senior tribe members of all 11 other or 12 tribes. Think about it. Surely he has a right to be offended. It was the church leaders that offended him. God had promised Abraham through him that he would bring forth a nation through the children of Jacob. The Lord Jesus would eventually come through them, and Joseph stayed free of the offense. And the plan of God was able to be established in his life and the lives of his brothers. Could it get any worse? Prison was a time of sifting for Joseph, but it was also a time of opportunity. There were two prisoners with Joseph, and both had those vivid, disturbing dreams. One man would be restored while the other would be executed, and Joseph asked the one that was about to be restored to remember him when he regained Pharaoh's favor. The man returned to service. 2 years comes, and you didn't hear nothing. Another letdown. But God always has a plan. And when the time came, and Pharaoh had a very alarming dream, and none of the magicians had an explanation, the restored servant remembers Joseph. And Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, and he told him what the dream meant. Pharaoh immediately promoted Joseph from a prisoner to second in command over all of Egypt, because Joseph chose not to be offended. Later, when the famine came, and we see all the known nations, Joseph's brothers had to come to Egypt. If Joseph had held anything in his heart, this would be the opportunity to get his revenge. And yet, we see he could have thrown them in prison, could have tortured them, could have killed them, could have blamed them. After all, didn't he have a right to get even? But Joseph ended up giving them grain at no charge. Oh, he messed with them a little bit to get his younger brother down there. But it was just to see if they were telling the truth. We find out that he gives them the best land in Egypt. Matthew 5:44, but I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good them that hate you, pray for them that which despitefully use you and persecute you. God knew what Joseph's brothers would do before they did it. In fact, the Lord knew what they would do before he gave Joseph the dream to begin with. I want you to listen to this in the NIV, Genesis 45:5-8. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save the lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will not be a plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God, who made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, and ruler of Egypt. The psalmist went on to say in 105:16-17, moreover, he called the famine upon the land, and he brake the whole staff of bread. He sent a man before them, even Joseph, who was sold for a servant. So who sent Joseph, his brothers or God? Out of the mouth of two witnesses, we see that it was God who sent him. Joseph said it plainly to his brothers, it was not you that sent me, but God. No man, no woman, no child, or even the devil can supersede the plan of God in your life. If you can get a hold of this truth, it will set you free. And here's the thing. There's only one person who can get you out of the will of God. Anybody know who that one person is? It's yourself. I am the only one that can get me out of the will of God. So look at the children of Israel as we come to a close here. God had sent a deliverer, Moses, to lead them out of Egypt, bondage into the promised land. And after a year in the desert, the leaders tried and went and spied it out. They returned complaining, and they were afraid of the nations in the land who were larger and stronger and had more military. All the people, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, agreed with the leaders. The people felt as if God had brought them out there to die, and they were offended with both Moses and God. And this pattern has been going on and on and on. Their offense resulted in a generation never getting to see the promise of God. So you see here, in the same sense, that God's promise was still there. He's going to fulfill his promise. It's up to you to choose whether you want to be a part of the fulfilling of the promise or if you want your offense to get you to be moved out of the promise. If you stay free from offense, you can stay in God's will. It's much more beneficial for you to stay free from offense. Because if the devil could destroy you at all, he would have wiped you out a long time ago. The devil knows about the splendor of heaven because he's been there. And he doesn't want you to go. Scripture says in 1 Corinthians 10 and 13, "There hath no temptation taken you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." A way of escape. Notice it. Understand it. James 4 and 7 says, "Resist the devil, and he will flee from you." If you resist the devil by not becoming offended, then he has no power to continue to mock you in your mind. We only risk aborting his will when we are disobedient and allow offenses to get us off track. Not many have suffered the treatment that Joseph received from his brothers. As a matter of fact, most of our offenses are nothing like what Joseph suffered. They were the ones who were supposed